In this video, we'll take a look at the quantitative parameters necessary to right-size an educational facility. This session will introduce your team assignment for the week and give you the tools to complete it. We will start this video off by going through the team assignment for the week, or student capacity modeling. As you know, you've been asked to assist your Course 2 client in the development of a new educational facility for 675 students in grades PK through 8. The new facility will be located on open land adjacent to one of your client's existing high schools. So to complete by this Sunday, teams need to develop a student capacity model that connects your client's vision to how learners will be accommodated. I've created a downloadable template for your use in completing this assignment. This module will cover student capacity parameters, and those include target size of student groupings, also known as class sizes, the target quantities of teaching stations, the identification of space types that can be used as teaching stations, and distinctions of all the above parameters per age and or grade level. Keep in mind that the next module will use this week's model to define space types and quantities and sizes. That's typically referred to as a space program. That will come next. This one is a capacity model that will inform the space program, but it is not intended to be a space program. What I'm looking for here is for you to demonstrate your understanding of space programming toggles and how to use them, to be creative in aligning capacity metrics with project vision and goals, to right-size facilities to promote the efficiency, understanding how capacity models can be useful in exploring ideas and promoting change, and of course, evidence of team collaboration. A key resource in this section includes a presentation that Kelly Tanner and I did a few years ago on how to calculate school capacity. Now, strategies in this document largely support current educational practices and systems like state and local construction funding and licensing requirements, and even structures for teacher contracts. But as structures for education evolve, it is expected, it's actually my hope, that methodologies for calculating school capacity will also evolve to become more accommodating of interdisciplinary learning, project-based activities, multiple size groupings, team teaching, asynchronous learning, off-site learning, alternate uses of time, just to name a few. In any case, justifying the size of a school facility based on the number of occupants, their activities, groupings, and supports is our task. Doing so with creative interpretation is our goal. For this week's assignment, you'll use a template framework for calculating student capacity. You will tailor the toggles, such as student groupings and utilization rates and teaching stations, to support your guiding principles, and then submit a capacity model for your signature project. There are many different toggles or quantitative planning parameters that go into any development of any space program. We'll touch on the top 4 of these, the ones that sort of have the most impact on building a space program. And we will go through these with more detail in each of the following slides, but we'll start with the number of students. So that's just student capacity. Then the average class sizes, the number of students scheduled for a particular class or grade of students. That includes also how many students might be off-site or unscheduled. The average space utilization, the time, the amount of time the space is scheduled for a class, and then the total number of teaching stations. So what counts as scheduled versus open, and what are the other options available for students to engage in. So we'll go through these next in a bit more detail. The first toggle is the number of students, or student capacity. While this may seem like a relatively straightforward calculation, it has some caveats that I think you should know about. We're going to start by going through some of the nuances of how students are counted. So first we're going to go through capacity. School capacity is, or student capacity usually refers to how many students are in the facility at any given time. So this is essentially counting full-time equivalents. The capacity is tied to spaces and how they are used and how frequently they are used. So any change in use, or sometimes even in the bell schedule, may change a school's capacity over time. Student enrollment refers to how many students are on the attendance ledger. Enrollment is often tied to funding, and it also may fluctuate over time depending on demographics and other external factors, who shows up on the first day of school. But it's important to note that these two numbers sometimes differ. For example, a half-day student counts as half of a FTE, but their name is listed on the enrollment ledger, so it's one student on the ledger. Or looking at it another way, if two students are both enrolled in half-day programs, say one in the morning, one in the afternoon, then they count as one FTE for the purposes of capacity, on site any given time, but they count as two students in the ledger, two names. Thus, capacity in this example totals fewer students than does enrollment. But if the school were to shift to full-day programs, then the school capacity would remain the same. Fewer students would be on the ledger, fewer students would be enrolled. So I'll show you some examples of how this works, and this will be useful for how you calculate your school's capacity. Let's start with an elementary school example. I've made very simple diagrams here to represent teaching station students and star teachers, but please keep in mind these are diagrams just to illustrate capacity. We truly don't promote boxes with 20 kids lined up in rows, and we're not making a recommendation for student-teacher ratios or anything there. My intent is simply to illustrate the calculation methodology, hopefully making the concept description more understandable. So please, please, please do not interpret these simple illustrations as optimal room arrangements. Back to the example, if we have a small half-day pre-K program and say there are 10 students in the morning and 10 in the afternoon, then our capacity is 10 students. But our enrollment is 20 because we have afternoon students as well on the attendance roster. So you'll have 20 students on the books, but for the architecture, we pay attention to the 10 who will be in that room at any given time. For grades 1 through 5, each group of students is typically assigned to a home-based space, like a classroom. In this example, we'll say there are 20 students in each of those classroom spaces. So in the grade 1 through 5 space, the student capacity actually equals the enrollment. But what happens when we have those specialty spaces in an elementary school like art and PE or even library? When students are participating in those programs, they often leave their home-based classroom to borrow learning environments that are more tailored to those specialty activities. Meanwhile, no other students use the homeroom classroom that those students just left. As this group of students relocates from one space to another, their location shifts, but this does not result in an enrollment increase. One student can only be in one space at one time. At the elementary level and for full-day pre-K, I won't say never, but rarely will another group of students use the vacated homeroom classroom. Leave their home-based classroom to take advantage of those programs, and so no other students backload that original classroom the students have just left, and so the capacity shifts and the enrollment shifts from one space to another. So when we look at the capacity of this example, we see that there would be 30 students in this example. However, our enrollment would be 40 because we have half-day program for pre-K. Let's look at some middle school models now. So let's summarize typical elementary school considerations and toggles for calculating capacity, because you have this as part of your assignment for the week. First is average class sizes, so the average number of students scheduled in a regular class, regular homeroom. Then the average number of students scheduled in SPED classes. There may actually even be different class sizes for things like PE as well, but these are the two big ones. Then we'll look at spatialization at the elementary school. It's really mostly whether it's half day or full day, and usually that's limited to pre-K, sometimes TK. but rarely do we see any half-day kindergartens in the US anymore. So half-day versus full day will have an impact, as you saw in the previous few slides. Also, the number of teaching stations, so the quantity of homeroom classrooms, how many classrooms per grade level. It will depend on how many students can be accommodated in those rooms. So as well as the quantity of sped rooms that we need to accommodate smaller student-teacher ratios. And then identifying what spaces are needed in the building, but they don't typically contribute to capacity. So there's borrowed spaces like art and music and PE and so forth. Your signature project includes elementary grades. Your teams will need to determine which quantitative toggles best support your vision and guiding principles. What number of students should be assigned to homeroom classrooms? Are there the same number of students in a first grade classroom as there are in a fifth grade classroom, for example? Will your school have half day or full day pre-K? What is your client's philosophy on meeting the needs of students with non-typical needs, i.e., IEPs and special needs? And would you propose self-contained classrooms for special ed, or would you should your special ed students be accommodated in more push-in into the homeroom classrooms along with their peers? Or is it a combination of the two? So those are quantities that your team will need to decide. Does your client's vision suggest that separate spaces for specials such as art and music will happen will be needed, or will they happen in the homeroom classroom? Sometimes art is the art teacher is on a cart. You've heard of that before, and the art goes to the typical classrooms. Of course, that's space efficient, but some hassle factor for the art teacher. But also, since the project scope includes middle school grades, will you recommend operating those middle level grades 6 through 8 the same as in elementary? So answering the same questions as shown here, or on a middle school model? That's going to be a question for you as well. Or is there some other type of blend? But we'll look at the middle school methodologies for calculating capacity next, and hopefully you can make a call for your team, which will be best. This example illustrates a middle school model, and we're showing the same diagram graphics, but in core spaces, we're going to keep 20 students per teaching station for these purposes of our calculation. And I'm showing 3 core teaching stations here. Let's say one is math, one is social studies, one is English, and then for the purposes of illustrating this example, I've shown one elective or exploratory teaching station. Let's imagine this as an art room that's shared by all middle school students. I'm going to point this out that what I'm showing is the little green dots are chairs, essentially, desks or tables, but they illustrate student seats. This isn't necessarily a student, it's a place for a student. So we know that not every place for a student is able to be accommodated every minute of the day, but just so that you know, this is why we're counting seats at the moment. And in this example, you can see there's 4 teaching spaces. They each have 20 students, and so the number of seats is 80. It's pretty clean and pretty clear. This is a very hypothetical situation, though, useful when you're planning FF&E, but not so useful when you're calculating capacity. Most middle schools and junior high schools use a rotational schedule, meaning the students move from various spaces to other spaces for different specific subjects. So when a class moves to an art space, for example, another class can occupy and use that core learning space that they just came from. Say a group of students in an English class goes to art. Well, another group of students may occupy that English room and the first group just left. Hypothetically, if we were talking about using every room 100% of the time, then our capacity would be calculated like 20 chairs in English, 20 chairs in social studies, 20 chairs in math, and 20 chairs in art. There would be 80 chairs shown in these 4 teaching stations. Student seat counts are useful for understanding certain aspects of the project, but it certainly isn't how you would calculate the actual capacity or enrollment of a middle school. In practice, it's actually really difficult, maybe impossible, to schedule all teaching stations in a middle school 100% of the time with the exact number of students each space can accommodate. So the space utilization toggle is that calculation factor that recognizes this reality of scheduling. In the US, a good rule of thumb is to calculate enrollment using 75 to 85% utilization for a middle school, meaning that 15 to 25% of the average school day teaching stations are either empty or used by teachers for planning prep, coordination meetings, etc. So in this example, if we use an average of 75% utilization, this means that 1 out of every 4 teaching stations are empty at any given time or used for other purposes. And so this example illustrates that the seat count of 80 becomes a more realistic 60 student capacity when we recognize those realities of time and space and teacher resources. With demographic shifts, schools may need to increase their space utilization to accommodate additional student enrollments. I'm frequently asked by clients to evaluate their current schedule and room use to see if there's any way they can increase the utilization so that they can add students to their enrollment without adding building or portables to the site. So looking at the toggles we've talked about, if the number of teaching stations must remain constant, so there's no additions, then a school's capacity can be increased by using the spaces they already have more frequently, increasing space utilization. This obviously is easier to do within schools where there's more critical mass of students and teaching stations to schedule. So the smaller the school, the less flexibility they have in this kind of expanding enrollment and increasing utilization. So in this example on the slide, we worked on a middle school where we analyzed their master schedule data and then color-coded their floor plans to illustrate how tightly or loosely each of their teaching stations are used or scheduled. So you can see the data on the right. I don't expect you to see the data, but it's all an Excel monster sheet. And then you'll see the floor plan, and areas that are not colored mean that it's not a teaching station, like cafeteria and offices and things. But the study illustrated potential areas that this school may be rescheduled to increase the number of students that they can accommodate. And what this actually did for them was allowed them to push off their building additions for another couple of years, and in order to gather the funding they needed to implement that project. So since your signature project includes middle level grades, 6, 7, and 8, your teams will need to determine which of these quantitative toggles best support your vision and guiding principles. So, ask yourself which of these, how do the toggles support your vision and your principles? What number of students should be assigned to core classrooms? Should it be 20? That's pretty low, but could it be? Are there the same number of students in, say, a science classroom as there are in a music room or a gym? What's your client's philosophy on meeting the needs of students with non-typical learning styles, IEPs? Would you propose, similar to the elementary, self-contained classrooms, or would SPED students be accommodated in the general population along with their peers, or a combination of the two? Could you combine the middle school with the elementary students? Again, it's going to be answered by how you decide to accommodate your vision. Does your client's vision suggest separate spaces for specials? And does that scope include a middle school model or a junior high school model? So, as I mentioned before, utilization rates can be higher in a junior high school than in a middle school. So while the capacity model assignment may seem like a simple task, it does require many decisions that are driven by that mission and vision and guiding principles. And then the capacity model will in turn have major impacts and will inform your program of space requirements that you'll get to next week.
Now, using a high school example, and this is very similar to higher ed, we take the same types of spaces. Higher ed may not have special needs, but they may have classes that are smaller, so you could pay attention to those classes there. But if we looked at 100% utilization, which again is hypothetical, our capacity for these 12, 13, 14 learning environments is 300 students. So 100% capacity, again, is hypothetical. It's very rare that, maybe even impossible, that one can schedule every single room, every single period. Now, if we look at a more realistic utilization, say 85%, typically high schools are between 80 and 90. We see that 3 classrooms would be empty, or 3 learning spaces would be empty at any given time, and our capacity goes down to 260. But one caveat that we find, and certainly this is with higher ed and becoming more prevalent at the high school level, is that there are off-site activities that students can be engaged in, which takes them out of the school altogether, and therefore they're on the ledger, but they're not in the building. So if we were to take, say, dual credit and internships and off-site facilities and take those 3 classes that are empty because of 85% utilization, we actually might be able to bump our enrollment back up. So keep in mind that with the boundaries of a school becoming more transparent and more fluid for learners to engage in activities that are off-site, our enrollments may go up and our on-site space needs may actually go down. Now let's revisit those toggles for space programming and capacity utilization. Obviously, the number of students on-site, full-time equivalent students, and recognizing that there may be students engaging in off-site learning and also part-time, for example, the pre-K example we showed. Average class sizes, the number of students scheduled in a class for a period. That may be different for different spaces, and there's certainly different schedules that can be accommodated. So pay attention to those caveats with your client. Average space utilization, which is the percent of time that is scheduled for a class to use a particular space, as well as space for teachers to plan and collaborate. Sometimes that happens within their class period, so or within their class space, and so count in those caveats as well. The total number of teaching stations, again, what counts as a teaching station? For example, in elementary school, an art room wouldn't count. It's certainly a space where students learn, but when they are not in their home-based classroom, no one else comes and fills that classroom. So students are either in one place or the other. What counts in terms of on-site versus off-site alternatives, again, gives you a more accurate number of count of teaching spaces required on campus versus off campus. And then special ed, how is special ed addressed in a particular school or district is very unique to that district. So self-contained spaces may be used instead of or in combination with push in and pull out services. So understanding the districts or the schools' philosophy on special ed will have an impact on how you count students and student capacity within your buildings. Now I'm going to take a minute to discuss this one particular parameter because this one has a lot of nuance as well, where you think, an average class size is an average class size. However, it can have some variables that may be unforeseen. So this is where engaging teachers and administrators in the conversation really helps. But an average class size, just defined as the number of students scheduled in a class, and if you take all of the classes in a particular school and tally those and then average those, that's your average class size. But these may vary for different purposes, different spaces, and so again, it's important to understand how those variations will affect your space program. So I'll give an example here of 3 spaces that are used in various ways. So we have 10 students in the first space and 25 in the other 2 spaces, but if you take the average of all those, we're talking 20 students average. So it may be that 10 students are in that class because 10 students are out that day, or it could be that 10 students are in that space because that is a special program, an IB program or an AP class that requires a smaller student ratio. So there may be lots of different reasons for why that room has only 10 students in it. There are some spaces that may have 50 students in them assigned every period. So all of those need to be factored in. And so you will be able to see when we get into the capacity worksheet how these come into play, but how easily it is to take an average of use, but that average doesn't really tell the whole story. So please pay attention to that as well. So this is an example of how variables for capacity can be used to project space needs. This is a relatively complicated project we tried to make into a simple spreadsheet. So that's always a little scary, but we are looking at those same capacity toggles and seeing how they impact this particular campus. So this was an existing facility, existing high school that had 2,400 kids. Their average class size was 22 students, and their average utilization rate was 71%, rather low. So in order to accommodate those 2,424 students, just doing the simple math means that we would need 140 teaching stations, which they currently had. So we looked at changing various toggles. They did want to increase their capacity up to 3,000, knowing future growth of the district and their demographics, but they really wanted to keep their class sizes small and their utilization rate down at 71%. So if we were just simply to increase capacity, what you see here is that the number of teaching stations goes up to 178. So the impact is measured in teaching stations is 38 additional teaching stations to accommodate that additional 600 students. So that's a rather large addition. So we looked at what other ways might we be able to adjust these toggles in order to help them not need to build such a large addition. So keeping that 3,000 student capacity toggle at their guide, their rule of 3,000, we thought, let's try increasing the class size. So if we just increase the average class size to 25 and keep everything else the same, then we only need an additional 15 teaching stations. So we're getting a little bit closer to meeting their budget. Another scenario we looked at is, again, keeping that 3,000 student capacity goal, maintaining the 25 student per class average, and then also increasing utilization. So this increases pretty much all of those toggles, and it tells us that actually we don't need an addition at all. Now this is, of course, just a numbers game, so it doesn't talk about the quality of space or the type of spaces. It just goes into those teaching station numbers, but we see that we don't need to add space to accommodate the additional students if we were to increase those toggles. And so another scenario we looked at was, let's say that 200 of those 3,000 students would be learning offsite in the community, in internships, online, and other ways. And that we still keep our class sizes higher. That seemed like it would be something that wouldn't be too difficult for them to be able to do within their district parameters, but they really wanted to leave that utilization rate low and allow some flexibility in how they use the building. That resulted in a net increase of 4 teaching stations required for this project. And so if we were to look at doing all of those things, it also tells you that we now have 11 additional spaces in the building. They weren't really interested in doing all of those things. So our final result was option D, where we looked at having some offsite facilities as well as increasing class size, but keeping that utilization rate low for their operational strategy. And this just summarizes how changing some of those toggles can affect the bottom line of space. And if you were to say a classroom in this district is 1,000 square feet, you can see how 38 additional classrooms would result in a very large cost for the district. So all of this sort of comes back to what can fit on the site, what cost can they bear, and how do they actually want to use their facilities.
Now back to your team assignment, the student capacity model. You understand the assignment, I've presented that before, but how do you get started? I'll give you a few tips. One of the first things is to understand what it is that we already know. We already know it's the vision client from class 2 that the facility is on open land. It's a new facility, that there will be a capacity of 675 students, and it will accommodate grades pre-K through 8. But is this enough information? No. Well, in addition to what you already know, there are a few additional items that need to be understood for you to complete this assignment. So since we don't have an actual client, you'll need to use the guiding principles and the vision statements to come up with your team's interpretation of these toggles. I like to call them strategic choices. So they're based on your client's vision and strategy for how they will run their programs. And so we'll just go through these one by one. First of all, a strategic choice will be our pre-K and K half day or full day. So that's 2 classes in the same classroom or a single class in that room. Will all grades operate in an elementary model, or will you split it between elementary and middle school? Do class sizes vary among the different grade levels? Oftentimes the kindergarten and pre-K are smaller, special ed is smaller than, say, a middle school classroom. You can decide. And if a middle school model is desired, then what grades are included in the middle school? 5-8, 6-8, 7-8. How is the day structured? How many periods in the school day? And how many periods per day do the teachers have classes? How many do they have prep or planning time or collaboration time with the other teachers in their teams? So all of these things are going to affect the capacity of the school, and that's why you need to determine how you're going to take a stand and answer all of these strategic choices.
I'll walk you through an example. Here's one example where the client's vision suggests that pre-K is half day and kindergarten is full day. And while the school family is pre-K through 8, both elementary and middle school models are included. Class sizes are driven by the client's belief that younger learners benefit from smaller class sizes, and since pre-K is governed by state daycare licensing, those class sizes are limited as well. The following averages were used. Pre-K at 15, half day, K through 5 at 20, full day, 6 through 8 at 24, in a middle school model utilizing 6 of 8 periods per day. And special ed is best as inclusion. However, at least 2 self-contained rooms were to be included in the new school, a maximum of 12 students in any self-contained special ed rooms.
I offer you a capacity model worksheet for this assignment. It's an Excel file that you can download from within Canvas, and it shows a simple chart of toggles and calculations for understanding the spaces required to achieve a given student capacity. In this template, the left column is grade levels and or space uses, and I've separated the elementary school component of the worksheet from the middle school component for the purposes of this example. You'll enter the values into the gray shaded areas. The unshaded areas will automatically calculate, so be sure not to alter those cell formulas. For each grade level or space use, enter the average class size, then enter the utilization rate percentage and the quantity of teaching stations that you anticipate needing to satisfy the 675 student capacity. The worksheet will then calculate the resulting capacities for you. And once data for all the intended uses are entered, you'll be able to double check and see how closely your model accommodates the project requirements. So continue adjusting your entries until you achieve the following. I want to see capacity balance among all grade levels, and I want to see the total capacity of 675 students. Once you and your team are satisfied that the model accommodates the capacity target and your client's vision and guiding principles, then submit the worksheet as your team assignment by the due date. I want to emphasize that there are multiple ways to achieve the 675 students. There's not one single answer here. It's not so formulaic. And I think you'll find that by testing out the use of this sample spreadsheet.
For example, if we enter in first grade 20 students at a utilization of 100%, and we say we need 3 of those, the capacity calculates out to being 60 students that can be accommodated in those 3 classes. Now, if we enter some data in the gray boxes in the middle school category and say the middle school classes are a bit larger than elementary, say 24 students, and we've determined that a 75% utilization is desired by the school, and say we just start by plugging in 3 classrooms for 6th graders. That tells us that we actually have 72 chairs, but we have a capacity of 54 students. So you can see by entering this data, you can follow down the bottom line and see how it affects the capacity, 100% capacity and the functional capacity of the school. Now I've done an example where I've filled in all of these numbers, and of course you can look at the bottom line and see there's over 800 students that can be accommodated in this model. So we're quite a bit over on our student capacity. So what I would do next is open the Excel file and begin toggling some of those parameters in the gray boxes until I found that I have space for 675. Now, the other thing to consider when you're looking at your capacity model is the continuum in a K-8 that starts with pre-K and goes through 8th grade. We could consider kindergarten through 8th grade to be a need to have relatively consistent numbers of students per grade level. As you can imagine, those kiddos in first grade move on to 2nd grade and on to 3rd grade and so forth. So we're looking at between 80 and 90 or so students in this example per class, but you can see as 5th grade comes into having more students per class, their capacity goes up. So where are we going to get those 5th graders? Because they didn't come from 4th grade, not in this model. So I would see that as an anomaly that I need to go back and toggle the class size or the quantity of spaces in order to take advantage of the consistency among student numbers per grade level. This, of course, happens also at the middle school level, and we also need to accommodate and account for the fact that middle schoolers go to their activity programs, which actually do count as utilization spaces. So where you see 0 entered at the elementary level, you see the normal 75% utilization added at the middle school activities. So this, of course, is spread across the middle school grades to take those numbers in this example of 56 students per grade, add the 75 that are in activity programs, and you'll get your consistent enrollment numbers there. And if not, keep playing with the numbers until you have it relatively consistent. So now it's your turn. I suggest you download the Excel spreadsheet template, rename it to your project name, and begin playing with those numbers so you can see how the various toggles can affect the bottom line. When you have this complete, we'll show you how you can use this to accommodate students when you begin translating these parameters into your facilities space program.
So once again, your team assignment for the week is a student capacity model, which will identify the parameters you will use next week to begin to develop a space program for your project. So again, this is the backbone to a space program, but it's not the space program itself. The credit and rubrics for the assignment will include understanding of space programming toggles and how those are used, creating an alignment between your capacity metrics and your project's vision, goals, and guiding principles, to be able to right-size facilities to promote efficiency of space and use, understanding how capacity model can be useful for exploring ideas and promoting change, and of course, evidence of team collaboration. In Module 4, we'll cover space programming, which will be based on all of the work that you've done so far.